Let me wrap up a couple things. I've been saying we're wrapping up Romans for like 3 weeks in a row.
In Genesis,
What?
in Genesis.
Well, that was us. I'd already been thinking it. He seemed to like the idea. We can talk about it. If we're not going to do Genesis, it won't hurt to do an intro to that whole period. And then we can do something else. But for the next week or two, since it's all I got, and I did this really fancy schmancy timeline here just for this, we might as well use it. This summer, if we want to do the worldview stuff, how we got here to this crazy world in which we live, with identity politics and everything, we can do that. But we can also just continue on with a book like Genesis. So we'll talk about that afterwards, maybe. Anyway, let me just wrap up a couple of things with Romans. Here's another fancy schmancy timeline. Let's see. Well, as we said, Paul wrote this letter in 57 or so from Corinth, which would be, here. Then he was going to Jerusalem. Then he was going to Rome, which he did, but he went to Rome under arrest because he was appealing his case before Caesar, the Caesar at the time being Nero. And then when he got to Rome, he's under house arrest. And so a lot of people think that the prison epistles, as we call them, were written from Rome then. But then that begs a question, because how could it certainly doesn't seem like, for example, 2 Timothy was written from his imprisonment in Rome, because in his imprisonment in Rome, and he is inclined to believe he's going to get a favorable hearing, and he plans on going back to Onesimus, probably at Colossae. But in 2 Timothy, it's obvious that he feels like he's at the end of it, that he's going to be executed right quick. And so the speculation would be then, and the testimony of church fathers would be that, the writers that came later, after this imprisonment in Rome, he had a successful hearing before Caesar, or whoever Caesar appointed. And then he was planning on going to Spain, but then maybe he went back east first, where he would have visited, for example, Philemon to deal with the Onesimus issue, the slave. Then he went to Spain. Then he came back to Rome. And when he came back to Rome, you'd be looking at somewhere between 64 and 66 AD. Well, in 64, there was a fire in Rome that destroyed a third of the city or something like that, at the heart of the city. And Nero, that's the famous saying, Rome burned. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Not fiddled. There was no fiddle. What was that instrument he played? Anyway, he was playing the instrument while Rome burned because he was on vacation somewhere. I forget where, and the fire broke out. So one of the theories was at the time that he started the fire, but he wasn't even in the city. And when he came back because of the fire, and they arranged all this help for the people who lost houses and possessions, for food and so forth. But after the fire, he used the opportunity to take over vast amounts of the middle of Rome to build this extraordinary palace to himself called the Golden House. I think it's called the Golden House.
It was good.
Yeah, I don't think he played the fiddle though. He played something else.
There were fiddles in that century. So
That's what I thought.
probably a liar. Anyway.
That's the Pantheon, isn't it? No, it's a Golden House. So that, it's artist reconstruction. It's all buried now. But he built this magnificent Golden House for himself, which they've uncovered in Rome. And the reason that they had to uncover it was there's this big pond or whatever that he built as well. And so after the Jewish war happened, it's amazing. The Jewish war happened in, the rebellion was 66 to 70, the revolt, and then 70, Titus's, what's that?
Fiddles didn't exist.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I know that one wasn't that.
The Scythera.
Yes,
But, Titus, who was Vespasian's son, who became emperor when Nero was assassinated, and then there was a couple of other emperors. They called it the year of the four emperors or something like that, 69 to 70. Oh, Rome almost went down. I mean, it was almost civil war. It's a big power vacuum. So anyway, Vespasian became emperor. Titus took over. He destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Then he went back to Rome, got his, what do they call it, triumph. They still have the ark of his victory over Jerusalem, in Rome. You can still go visit that. It's extraordinary. But anyway, then they began construction of the Colosseum in 72, using the funds that they plundered from Jerusalem, by the way. And they built it because Nero's golden house was so unpopular. They built it on the same site. So they drained the pond, they filled in whatever they needed to do, and they built the Colosseum on that location. And so it all disappeared under the earth, and then they rediscovered it within the last however many centuries. And they've been excavating and they found it again. Anyway, it would be during that period, you know, of post 64 to 66 perhaps, when things took a decidedly bad turn for Christians and Jews everywhere, including Rome. When Paul finds himself in Rome and is in trouble again, only the outcome this time is he gets executed, along with Peter. So James died. James was assassinated, executed by the high priest in Jerusalem, stoned, I believe, in like 62. So he was actually the first one to go. Very highly regarded in Jerusalem by the Jews, which is why when the new governor came in, that high priest was assassinated by the Jews.
Are you talking about James' brother John?
No,
Okay.
James, the brother of Jesus, yeah. Who would have been basically leader of the Jerusalem. He's very highly regarded. He was called James the Just. Even Josephus refers to him in high regard, James the Just. But he got assassinated. Then they took it out. They took it out on Ananias, who was the high priest who did that, who was the high priest that Paul went before in about 58, when he tried to give his testimony when he almost got beaten to death in Jerusalem for supposedly defiling the temple. That was the high priest. And he was the high priest was the one that ordered him to be slapped because he didn't like something he said. And so Paul responded with that famous statement that was foreshadowing or prophetic. God is about to strike you, you whitewashed wall, or something like that. Right out of Isaiah or one of those, I forget which one it was. Yeah, and it turns out that God was about to strike him. And within a very short time, you know, he would be at his end as well. Anyway, so Paul went back to Paul. Peter then, the tradition goes, and I have no reason to doubt it, ends up in Jerusalem, ends up in Rome. He is executed, independent of Paul. Paul is executed, this is the theory, on his second Roman imprisonment, which would be sometime before 66, probably after the fire in 64, somewhere in that period. And somewhere in there, you get 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which have a very, very pessimistic tone about them. Everybody's deserted. You know, Demas, famous statement, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord repay him for his deeds, or something like that. Demas, having loved this present world, has departed. He's mentioned a lot as a co-worker, even I think even in Philemon, he's mentioned as a co-worker. So sometime between then and Paul's execution, things got real rough. All those churches then, now we're into the post-destruction period, when the church is settling in to a new life. There's no, the eyewitnesses are gone except for a couple. Peter and Paul are gone, James is gone, etc. You have John, who's probably going to write his letters, all of his writings here in the 90s, when Domitian, who was Titus's brother, Titus being the son of Vespasian, the great emperor, middle of Pax Romana. Anyway, Domitian kind of came down on the Christians as well. He was tough on the Christians, which maybe is how John ended up on the island of Paphos.
Was that to help the Christians run away and spread the gospel?
If you want to get in the mind of God, one of the effects would be, well, that's the way I handle this kind of thing, since God didn't tell me such. One of the effects was certain things. But on the negative side, all of those churches disappeared. You know, the 7 churches of Asia Minor that we talked about, plus Colossae, Jerusalem.
Because of the persecution, you think?
You know, I don't know, but my guess is, yeah, some of them stayed, some of them remained. So for example, even in the 4th century, 5th century, I think Augustine, the greatest of the church fathers, one of the greatest thinkers in Western civilization ever, rivaling Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. He was from, I believe, Alexandria, which became then a center of manuscript copying, which is never even mentioned as a place where Christians were in the New Testament.
Yeah.
But it becomes a new kind of home center for Christians.
And when was that again?
Alexandria?
Yeah, well, Augustine.
Augustine would be the 5th century,
Oh,
the 400s.
that's a while.
Yeah. Yeah, Antioch hangs around for a while. I don't remember how long Ephesus lasted, but the point being, they all disappeared, you know, into the ruins. The Muslims invaded in the 7th century, the 600s. You know, they wipe out all that manuscript copying in Antioch, in Alexandria disappears after that, which is the Bible that we have from the Alexandrian tradition of, thank God for Alexandria,
Yeah.
which we never read about in the New Testament. We care about Ephesus and these other churches, but Alexandria is a church which it's hard, you'd be hard pressed to find a church that affects your life more than Alexandria did, because that was the one that
That's
preserved.
in Egypt.
Yes,
isn't it?
preserve for you, that's right, preserve for you the New Testament that you read. Yeah. So none of that story is in the New Testament. That all happens after the 1st century. So that pretty much closes it out. After the destruction of Jerusalem, the Sadducee side of organized Judaism fades out. That's the priestly class, but the temple's gone. So what place do the Sadducees have anymore? And they're not particularly liked by the people anyway, they're aristocrats, and they're very closely associated with the Romans. So after 70, they all but disappear, and what rises then to the top is the Pharisaical schools. Hillel and Shammai, I think is the other one, I forget how to say it. And so those rabbinical schools rise and they take over and continue things. And of course, they hate the Christians too, but
They're still in Jerusalem.
they were allowed to, the Jews were allowed to remain in Jerusalem. Then in 132 AD, you know, they never give up. So, you know, Masada, basically the Jewish revolt ended in 70, but then Masada, 72, but then the Masada, the great Stone Mountain fortress that you read about, where they had the 900 that committed suicide, that happened in, I think, 73. And that was it, and it disappeared. But the Jews were allowed to remain in Judea. But then in 132, there was another rebellion, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. You can look that up. I think that was Trajan. You can look, I forget which one. It was either Hadrian or Trajan. I get those two guys mixed up. Emperor. And with the defeat of that rebellion, that's when the Romans said, we've had enough, and they forbid Jews from occupying the land of that land anymore. And that's it. They will not reoccupy the land until 1947. Before that, but 47, they by 47, they're on, he's right. 48 is when they declare a state in 48, but it's in there in the mid to late 40s when they begin to immigrate back. They were actually getting sent back to Germany. Jews that try to go to, you know, what we call Palestine now. And they would get sent back to Germany by the British, I guess. They had the mandate. But then everything changed. Everything changed with the British mandate changed it. And then by 48, there's a state of Israel. But that's when they start coming back for the first time. Really. An extraordinary story. So now you can see why they behave the way they do in times like these that they're in right now. Okay, so that closes it out. That's the New Testament period. There, you know, how does God work? And the answer is depends. If you try to apply a single template to how God operates, you will fail every time. He's someplace for a while and then he goes someplace else. And he might leave something behind forever. He might leave something behind for a little while, or he might leave nothing behind.
Like America.
Exactly. And nobody's immune. So that's just the ways of God. And you can see that in all this work Paul did. Planted a gospel that continues to germinate, but not in the places where he planted it. In fact, it's conspicuous by its absence from places like Ephesus, which is modern day Turkey, right? Which is Muslim. I mean, it's not that it used to be the case within the last 30 years that you didn't say you were a Christian. You kept that secret. I don't know if that's still the case or not, but it's they're one of those, they're a Muslim country. Are they a little like Egypt? I have to ask a friend of mine who's an expert at this. Egypt is a secular country with a large Muslim population that has it has decided it wants to remain a secular country. And so they won't allow, for instance, after what's his name, Hosni Mubarak was run out of the country, who we supported for 40 years and then just abandoned, or 30 years. After that happened, he's a brutal secular dictator. After that happened, the Muslim Brotherhood stepped in, tried to take over, but the Egyptian military said, nope, we're not going to be that. So it took over and kept the country as a secular country because they're not going to allow it. Turkey's a kind of a special case. I don't really know much about it. It's Islamic, but it's not, it's not Islamic like Saudi Arabia or Iran or something like that, even though it aligns with. Is that Shiite? It might be. I don't remember which.
They don't make the women run around.
I don't know. I don't, I'm kind of ignorant of that. But anyway, the point of all this is that all happened afterward. Islam took over all those areas. And, still is. They don't give up ground readily. So that's all I got to say about the book of Romans. Anybody want the last word on Romans? Here's the gospel as you see it, as I understand it. If you think in terms of historical events, start at the bottom. The gospel is the promise of a Messiah. Promised, rejected, crucified, vindicated, exalted, enthroned, proclaimed, and victorious.
So where do you see victorious? Is that just being in heaven, or?
Exactly.
Okay.
When is the victory of God?
Because you were talking about all these towns where they trusted Christ, but now they don't seem to be Christian anymore.
We, I believe, live between proclaimed and victorious. And we await the great day when he will take his throne from wherever he is, however you want to think of that, to this earth. In my view, to Jerusalem, and he will rule the nations, whatever that means, from this planet.
New earth.
A new earth, yeah. That's victory. This is the first indications of victory, but victory comes with the defeat of the enemy. And that isn't going to happen until he comes back and defeats them personally. And then you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with great glory, and so on and so forth. But I believe we live between, here's the first appearing right here, and here's the second appearing, and we live between the two appearings in this here. So we live in that period where we reflect on what happened and proclaim it, and we anticipate his return and the victory that it brings. And we live in that same period Paul lived in, just later on the timeline. And that's also the gospel proclamation in Acts by both Peter and Paul. That's it right there. That's why I used it. Okay, shutting it down. So much for the golden domus. Doesn't come across very well in English. Genesis chapter 50. I think we should start in Genesis chapter, we're gonna start talking about an intro to Genesis. I think we should start in Genesis chapter 50. What do you all think?
Hey, there we go.
You all thought we were gonna start in Genesis chapter 1, but I'm a contrarian. I'm gonna do the opposite. I'm gonna start at the end. And you'll see why. Huh? We don't, yeah, yeah, you'll see as we go here. But, let's just, what do I got here? Let me see what mine. Here's a timeline. We're trying to get to we want to understand this statement. That's the statement we want to understand. And I was looking through the various translations of this first verse of the Bible. And I found out a couple of interesting things. So here's here's what, 7? Here's 7 different translations of the first verse of the Bible. And they're all the same except for 2. The International Children's Bible chooses to say God created the sky and the earth. Created sky and earth. I don't think they quite have that right. I think in the mind of the writer of Genesis, he was including God's domain in some way. So heavens might be right in the transcendence, in the double entendre sense, in the 2 meaning sense. You can certainly translate that word sky, and you can do the same thing in Greek in the New Testament. The heavens parted and the Spirit descended upon him like a dove. It's the skies parted. Or is it the heavens parted? It's hard to tell. When he was taken up into heaven in Acts chapter 1, you could also say he was taken up into the sky. It's the same thing. Hebrew has the same. I don't know Hebrew. I can't read Hebrew. I gave up on it in 1999 when I realized that on my lifespan, I was never going to get there. So I
Maybe
just,
sky is more like day 2 instead of verse 1.
yeah, I don't know. But anyway, I find that interesting that they chose that. I don't disagree with it necessarily. But it's one of those verses where you don't want to mess with. It's like the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Even if it's not exactly the right translation, just, don't fight the battle. There's no reason to fight that fight. Just let it sit just like that. And this might be one of those as well. It's an extraordinary statement of simplicity and brevity that would have been unknown for reasons we'll get into and I think it's deliberately this way, in that polytheistic world in which that the Israelites came out of. The idea that you could encapsulate all of creation, the creative forces and the creative events in a single statement that is in English 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 words is in itself extraordinary. It's also, in my view, and I'll defend this later, the chief premise, the foundation upon which all of biblical revelation is built, all of it, and your worship and your faith in God. If he is not if he is the creator, then he is deserving of your worship and service, period. If you know nothing else about him, which is why every single creature, God is owed worship and service of every single creature of his, precisely because he is the creator. And if he is not the creator, then he's just another one of the gods, and he can be dispensed with, or offered some sacrifice to appease him or something like that, which we'll get back to. But anyway, look at the last one, the message. All those times I've hit the message, right? There's something to that. First, this. God created the heavens and the earth. And it's not right in terms of translation, but they capture a transcendent truth about it and purpose of it that I find interesting that they threw that in there. Chiefly across the entire spectrum of biblical revelation, chiefly, first and foremost, God created the heavens and the earth. But we'll go back to all that.
Well, I think that in the beginning basically is, it's kind of like John 1:1. He starts that in the beginning, and it's basically telling us that God has always been. That's what, at least in the beginning, that's what I interpret in the beginning, that God has always been, and
Yeah.
always will be. The first, this kind of is not really that displaying that, it's just saying this is the first thing that God did.
Yeah. Well, then maybe they didn't realize the significance of their own statement in the context of what I'm talking about.
Because in the beginning, basically, it's telling us that God has always been here. I think that's the. pretty much-
Yeah, what's interesting about the Bible, Genesis though, is he doesn't defend that. In the beginning, God, so God is excluded from creation by definition, by the very nature of it. God created. He's simply found there. At the moment of creation, you simply find God there present, creating. He's simply there, without explanation of how it could be or why it was or anything else. He just is found to be there at creation. Okay. Here's my first attempt to try to capture some important things that go into understanding Genesis chapter 1. And we're going to start here. We probably won't finish this today, but that's all right. We never finish anything I say we probably won't finish today. We don't ever finish today. This is the way it is. We'll get back to this in a little bit. But let's go back to Genesis chapter 50. Let's try to understand what very few people, oh, I got notes. Hold on a minute. Should probably look at my notes. Very few people think of Genesis as having a context. So we talk about the context of Romans, for example. When was it written? Whoa, where was it written? Why was it written? Who was the audience? But we don't really ask those questions about a book like Genesis. Maybe the most important book to ask that question about is the book of Genesis. So we're gonna look at that. We're gonna start in Genesis chapter 50. Because remember, the book of Genesis, of course, was not written during the period in which is covered by the chapters of Genesis, which end here. The period of Genesis is this on the timeline. Genesis wasn't written during this part of the timeline. Genesis wasn't even written in this part of the timeline. Genesis was written, like in my view, somewhere right here. We're talking, well, after creation, however many years that is, but even after Abraham, we're talking 800 years. Or some, so I forget the number, but do the math. Let's just go with 2075. Let's just say 1456, 1460, 2075, 600 years or something like that later. So that's what we want to talk about here a little bit. To understand that, let's start in Genesis chapter 50, which is the end of the book, where we find Joseph and the entire clan, that's an important word, we'll get back to it, of Jacob, who was the descendant of the promise through Isaac, through Abraham. So Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. Jacob is going to have 12 sons. They're going to be known as the 12 tribes later. They're not tribes yet. They're just a family clan. And that entire family of 70, I think the number is, it might be a little higher than that, 70 or 72 or something like that, ends up back in Egypt because of a famine. We're going to cover all this in a study of Genesis. But there in Canaan, Joseph has been sold into slavery in Egypt up here in Goshen. Or no, I'm sorry, no, not yet. He's been sold into Egypt as a slave. He prospers because of God. He does well. He becomes the administrator of the land as appointed by the Pharaoh. And then with that power, he will preserve his own family clan when there's a huge famine. And the entire clan will move into Egypt. And they will settle in what is known as the land of Goshen, because the Egyptians don't want anything to do with these Jacobites, because these Jacobites are sheep herders. And they find that loathsome. And so Joseph makes an arrangement with the Pharaoh to, honor the sensibilities of the Egyptians, and they're going to stay up there. The side effect of that is going to be, and this is where we're back to the purpose of God, but it doesn't say that. The side effect of that is going to be that's anachronistic. The Jacobites, let's call them that, this family clan, will maintain its own internal identity as they're not really even allowed to intermingle with and assimilate into the Egyptian way of life, Egyptian people group, because of who they are. So they will be forced to have an invisible boundary around themselves, which will allow them to develop as their own people in this new land. which probably would not have happened had they stayed in Canaan. They would have intermarried. And they may have lost their identity. And so now we're getting back to the purpose of God. Perhaps moving them to Egypt long enough for them to maintain their own cohesive identity and be big enough that he could then form a nation out of them. Or something like that. Plus 100 other reasons that I have no idea about. I'm simply saying that's one of the outcomes. One of the outcomes is they did not assimilate into the Canaanite populations by intermarriage or something. They ended up in Egypt where they maintained their own sense of identity. We'll get back to this map too, as we talk about this. So back to Genesis chapter 50, the strange way for a book to end. Joseph was a slave. Remember, he was sold as a slave by his brothers into Egypt. And then he was noticed. He spent a couple of years in prison for a wrong he did not commit. And then he rose to power, but still technically a slave. You don't just simply throw off your slave status. It didn't work like that. So now he has enough power, he brings his entire clan in, and they do well in Egypt. The book then closes with this statement by Joseph, which is, of course, foreshadowing, and leads to a sense of anticipation. We'll get back to that word. In verse 24, says Joseph, I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And then the author refers to the people that Joseph is talking to as the sons of Israel. But there is no Israel at this point. Israel doesn't exist.
But that was the name of Jacob, wasn't it?
Yes, but of course, this is a double entendre.
Okay.
It's not just Jacob, the recipient of the covenant, renamed Israel. It's Israel. To people in later generations, Israel is more than just the name of the name of the patriarch. It's a national identity for the people of God. So you'll always have this double entendre working whenever you see a phrase like the sons of Israel. But anyway, this then sets up anticipation for what will happen next. Will God, to get this reminder of the covenant promise that God made to Abraham in, name the chapter. Somebody.
Well,
Let's go with that. There was a promise in chapter 12. There was a promise in chapter 12 to the land which I will show you, and I will bless you. Kind of vague. We're going to have meat on the bones. What exactly is God going to do on behalf of Abraham or for Abraham? But there's the promise upon which the covenant is going to be built. This blessing right here, I will bless you, is the part, well, exactly. Abraham's going, I hear big talk, God. I didn't really know you before like 15 minutes ago. I was a pagan idolater up in Haran, maybe, coming from a family of pagan idolaters in the city of the Chaldeans. We'll talk about that later. So, you just appeared to me. You made me do this. What are you really going to do? Well, that comes through in chapter 15. Where we see the promise. It's been mentioned earlier, but this is the formal sort of a codification of the promise. He's going to make a covenant. On that day, the Lord made a covenant, the details we'll get to later, with Abram, that's what he was called at that time. To your descendants, I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. So the promise, the covenant was just for the land of Canaan. That covenant, in their minds, covenant equals land. And we'll get back to that. But that's it. There are other things that
promise of descendants there too.
Yes, a nation, yes, a prosperous nation who will be the people of God on the land of Canaan, which will become the land of Israel.
The only thing is, if you, that land actually was a lot more than if you look where the Euphrates is, a lot farther north than even what Israel actually took, so.
Yeah, here's the Euphrates. They will not actually reach the full scope of the promised land until Solomon. And they won't have it for very long.
Mhm.
But it will take centuries before they actually achieve in scope the promise, the land of promise.
What's the river of Egypt? Are we talking about Nile?
I don't know what else they'd be talking about, which would roughly correspond to Sinai too, I guess, or something, but nobody wants Sinai. I didn't even think about that, but I don't know what other river they could be talking about. We'll get back to that. Oh, we're gonna get back to all this stuff. I'm just introing. So that's the sense of anticipation with which Genesis ends. The strange way for the book to end. The book ends with the entire clan being formally a slave people group in Egypt, and they're not even on the land. So the promised land was promised in Genesis chapter 15, codified. But when the book ends, not only are they not on the land, they're a slave people in Egypt. So it sets up this tremendous anticipation of, will God keep his promise to Abraham? If he does so, how on earth is he going to pull this off? Because he's going to have to rip them out of the hands of the Egyptians. If you turn the page, Exodus begins exactly where Genesis 50 ends, only 400 years later. And that 400-year period is skipped over. It's just fast forward across the timeline and you're there. He has no interest in talking about it. So what happened during this 400-year period? Well, one thing that happened was, as he says here, in verse 8, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Ominous statement, and that would have happened fairly early. Not like 350 years later. But as soon as that protective cover that Joseph had because of his connection to that Pharaoh, when that Pharaoh died, that protective cover disappeared. And what would have happened then was the slave status of that entire clan would have asserted itself. And they would now descend into simply being a slave people group, maybe even with some resentment, especially if that Pharaoh had treated them on favorable terms over and against the Egyptians.
So it says this new king arose, and he said, behold, the people are more and mightier than we. So would that necessarily have been the next king after Joseph died, or would it have been
I think it's talking about an extension over the timeline. Over time,
at the time?
what you're seeing here, right there in verse 7. Remember the promise to Abraham. I will make of you a great nation. I will multiply your seed. If you look at the stars, if you can count the stars, you'll be able to count your descendants. And so this right here is a statement of fulfillment. It's not just, by the way, there's a lot of Israelites, or he's using his sons of Israel again. Bit anachronistic a little bit with a double meaning. But no, that's a statement of fulfillment. During that time period, during the 400 years of silence and slave ship, God was fulfilling his promise. So anticipation, the rise and fall of Israel. That's what I'm calling this. We have promise to Abraham, which leads to covenant for land to Abraham, which then eventually leads to anticipation of the fulfillment of the covenant promise, which begins at the close of Genesis through Joseph. I want to promise from you that you're not going to leave my bones here, because God's going to take you back to Canaan just like he promised. But that's the anticipation. Now we reach Genesis where we have fulfillment. But even here, you can see the anticipation, right? Things are building to a point of something's got to be done because the slave people is uncontrollable in terms of numbers. And it's just a matter of time. They can do the math. If this continues, they will end up taking over Egypt. And we can't allow that to happen. Their solution to the problem was not a good solution. But that's how I read what's going on. I don't know what they mean by mighty exactly. They wouldn't have been allowed to have weapons of war probably and so forth, but you can make those. So that the land, look at the, go
I
ahead.
think what it might be too is the fact that the Israelites increased so multiplied so fast over those 400 years. They might have had more Israelites than they had Egyptians.
Yeah,
Because if you look at Egypt, they didn't have, they're basically only had cities here and there. Most of it's all desert. So the land of Goshen, when Joseph gave it to him because after the Pharaoh at the time, because it was one of the best areas of Egypt, because it was all grassy and everything else, so they could feed all their animals.
that would lead to resentment too.
And so basically, they probably increased much to the point where they might have had more Israelites than they had Egyptians. Because of the fact that they only had these certain cities where most of the people live, and most of Egypt is desert. So that's probably what he was looking at, saying, hey, they actually outnumber us as Egyptians, we need to do something about it.
I was watching a documentary on this, because everything you see on YouTube is true. So I was watching this documentary and, they thought that if you assume that there were 2 to 3 million Egyptians or something like that, the report in Exodus is going to be 600,000 men, I think, are going to come out of Egypt, these Israelites, 600,000 men. Now do the math on the number of children per women, and you're going to get comparable numbers, at least in terms of scale. So if you're the Egyptians and you're looking at this people group, that's alarming. You don't have to extend the timeline very long to know. You can't have a people group. You can't have a slave people group that's bigger than well, you can if you're the Romans, I guess. But
They wouldn't have been slaves though. It was only until the Pharaoh said, hey, we need to make them because of the fact that they're.
now that's possible. That's possible that they weren't considered, but they were assigned to be brick makers of bricks and so forth. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the slave status didn't assert itself until it was needed, which would be right there at the end. Maybe.
Basically, Joseph had said, hey, we'll take care of your flocks. We'll be your shepherd. We'll be your shepherds and take care of your flocks. And stuff that even though they didn't necessarily have a lot of in Egypt because they didn't believe in that type of stuff, but basically Pharaoh said, hey, yeah, they can take care of our flocks and stuff like that. So, they wouldn't, but they weren't considered slaves just because they were.
Yeah, we don't know when that would have happened, but at some point, when was this? When did this new king arise? Is that 200 years in? Is that 300 years in? Is that just before the events that are about to take place? We don't know when any of that happened. But they saw the writing on the wall and they said, we got to do something about this. And it's not like these people are ever gonna, okay, why don't you guys go free? Just, go somewhere else. Or here, just take the land. You can be your own people group on our land. All these peoples are imperialistic and aggressive, all of them. They don't, it doesn't work that way. Every man for himself. They fight, hold your land because somebody else is going to try to take your land from you. That's their mindset. But at any rate, the point here being, of course, that it's fulfillment. It's both fulfillment and anticipation that things are coming to a boil and something's going to have to be done because it's going to boil over. And so the Egyptian answer is this. We're going to make them hard pressed, and it's going to turn out, we're going to press on them hard, and it's going to turn out that the more they press on them, the more they multiply. So, they can't figure out, well, maybe that didn't work, so we got to do something else. So just, what they also don't know is that they're going to be fighting with this God. They're not just going to be fighting this people. They don't understand that the reason for the multiplication and the problems they're having is not them, but the God who is behind it, who has been silent all this time, who made a promise. And so what you see here is a God he's making his way in, and they can't see him coming because they don't have the sort of cultural tools, the mindset to be able to understand how a God can simply impose himself outside of his own domain, because these are, we'll get to this too, but they have a territorial approach to deity. So you have the Nile, the God of the Nile, the God of the desert, which is, I'm convinced, is what the way that they thought of the God of Israel, the God of the desert. You see that with the Philistines in 1 Samuel 5. Here comes the ark. They take the ark, and by taking the ark back to the land of the Philistines, they think they've conquered their God. Not just, they take that God back. They take the ark back to the temple of Dagon, and they put the ark before Dagon. Well, all of a sudden, their land is hit with all kinds of pestilence. They figure out that it's this. They think, oh, it's this ark. It's this God. So their answer is, we got to get this God back to where he was. So they put him on a cart. They put the ark on a cart. It's an extraordinary story in 1 Samuel, the Dagon story in 5. The author slows the narrative down and he starts, oh man, let's look at it. It's an unbelievable story. I've done.
He basically got and snacked their cat over on the floor, and they wonder how in the world that happened.
All right, so they take this God, this ark. They think of the ark as the God. So did the Israelites, in my view, at this point. We'll get back to that. Hand of the Lord was heavy on the Ashdodites. He ravaged them, smote them with tumors. Ashdod being one of the 5 cities of the Philistines. Well, I'll start earlier. Now, the Philistines took the ark of God, brought it to Ashdod, one of the 5 cities on the coast, where Gaza is right now, where that war is happening, over in Israel. Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon, their chief god, and set it by Dagon in prostration before Dagon. When the Ashdodites arose early in the next morning, look how he slows the narrative down to describe this. It's dripping with sarcasm. Behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. Yahweh. That's Yahweh, right? He switched the ark of God to the ark of Yahweh right there. So they took Dagon and set him in his place again. They had to do it. Look at the irony. Their God can't get up. They have to set their God back up again. But when they arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. The Lord again, not God. And the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. And it's this pathetic picture of this impotent nothing God before the God of Israel that they think is the ark. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor all who enter Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. It's an unbelievable story. It gives you an insight into their mindset about deity and how things work. So their solution to this problem may seem ridiculous to us, but it's the only one they had. They send it to other places in the land of the Philistines. There's 5 cities. They weren't a nation. They were just this confederation of 5 cities. And everywhere it goes, it just causes all kinds of pestilence. So they put it on a cart with a couple of cows that don't know how to return to their mother. I forget how the detail comes out. And they set it up the road. They set it off up the road to Beth Shemesh, I think it is. I forget the name of the city. Somebody can look for it. And then just hope to get it out of their territory, because they figure if the God gets back to where its home is, it will leave them alone. And so that's exactly what happens. It gets back to the city.
It just gets outside the border, basically.
We got rid of that God. Whew, that was close. It gets back to Beth Shemesh, I think that's the city. And they do it wrong. So God strikes that city. So they say to the Levites from someplace else, Jabal, I can't remember now. Hey, can you come and get this thing? Because we don't know what to do with it. It's just, we don't like it any more than the Philistines do. So the Levites come and they grab the thing and they take it correctly someplace else. I forget how the story goes. Beth Shemesh, yeah. There's a little insight that's very, very anachronistic because the Dagon incident, it's 10:15. The Dagon incident didn't happen until just before Saul was anointed king. So we're talking 1,000 years after Abraham. So we're way anachronistic, but it is a good picture as to how these people groups thought of deity, very territorial. So from their vantage point, it's going to turn out the way that they think of it, their God, the God of this slave people is going to intervene, and he's going to want to take the people to his territory, and his territory is the desert of Sinai. Because Moses is going to say, you need to let us go out a 3 days journey into the desert so we can sacrifice to our God. In their minds, he's the God of the desert, like what's his name is the God of the Nile. You know, you have Ra, the sun god. You know, you got all these gods. They got all these gods. Well, eventually they're going to have to submit, and they're going to say, "Yeah, we got to get these people out into the desert to appease their God, or there would be nothing left of us." So they're going to run the Israelites out of Egypt. It will not be an exodus. It will be an expulsion. That's why the Passover is going to be the way that it will be. You stand up. You eat the Passover fully clothed, standing up, and you eat it in a hurry because you will not have time to finish it on the first Passover. That's how much the Egyptians are going to want you out of their territory. And they're just going to flee as the Egyptians drive them out, which is also why the Egyptians are just going to take this. Anything you want, take it. Just go out to the desert. It's going to be like, that's frantic. The Passover represents a frantic attempt, desperate attempt from the Egyptian point of view, to get these people out of Egypt and into the desert for their desert god, so they can appease their desert god before we get destroyed. That's what's going on in what we call the Exodus. And that's probably what the video would show if we had it. So we'll continue right there. We are going to get back to, remember, let me close with this. At this point in Israelite history, after these 400 and some odd years, they've completely, in my view, they've completely forgotten about the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac. They are idolaters. They have no familiarity with this God whatsoever, any more than the Egyptians do. So this is starting all over, which is going to lay the groundwork for why a book like Genesis even exists. Because it's going to be written in the aftermath of the Exodus to this people group. So that's where we'll start next time. And that's it. Anybody want the last word? Roger. Okay. Naomi, thanks for joining, if you're still there. I don't know if you are or not. I'm gonna go
Thank
ahead.
you, Gary.
I'll see you on Tuesday night.
Planning on it.
Bye.